This week on In Post, doing a bit of masking to put together a nice story outside the cathedral in Seville, Spain. Hi everybody, welcome back to In Post. My name is Scott Davenport, and this week processing images from outside the cathedral in Seville, Spain. If you didn't see the In the Field episode for this, you can have a look at that and get some behind the scenes understanding of where I was set up and how I chose to shoot and why I have a couple of images that I'm going to put together here today in post. So to the photos, the idea here is I've got two different shots outside of the Seville Cathedral. One of them is the main structure itself, which is pretty much devoid of foot traffic, and the other has a horse-drawn carriage that's starting to move through the frame. And so I want to put those two together to tell a full story outside this cathedral. You know, this carriage going up to the building's very nice, it's blue hour. And so let's dive into the machine and get started. I have two images selected that I want to blend together. I have one here of the cathedral itself and the square, and that's all nice, very few distracting elements in it. And then I have one with the horse going through the frame. I make these bigger. So we've got, nice, clean, very little foot traffic. There's just a couple of folks that are hiding right down in this area here. Those will be easily taken care of with a little masking and erasing. And then we've got the other image where I would just want the horse-drawn carriage. So there's some cleanup that I did here in Lightroom first. Let's take a quick review of that. In the Develop module, we can see what did we do here. So let's actually just hit the Tab key and get these both open. So let me start at the bottom here. We started with lens corrections and white balance. And very simple as far as the white balance. I actually used, open this up here, I used the eyedropper and selected one of these grayish areas at the top of the dome. That's a pretty neutral gray. And they did a nice job with the white balance overall. This is still a little bit of a yellowish greenish cast, but I'll take care of that in the photo suite. And I did a little bit of cleanup on that here in Lightroom too. Next is tone and presence. And so that was still bringing up the exposure a little bit, play with the highlights and the shadows to really stretch out that histogram and make sure I've got a good range of everything, as well as setting the white point. And a very, very tiny tug on the blacks just to get a couple of pure blacks in the shadow areas under the dome and a little bit underneath the trees. A little boost of clarity and vibrance, a touch of color there. Now the last thing is hue, saturation, and luminance. I started to play with this, and this was to address some of the color casting. If I go back one step, you can see this greenish, yellowish cast here. Taking care of hue, saturation, and luminance was able to correct that. And so in the orange-yellow range, you can see the hue is being tugged down a little bit, as well as the saturation. And that was really it. It was, grabbing these little pulleys, picking on an area and pulling up and down until I got something that looked nice. So again, before and after. Then took all of these settings and copied them to our second image. So I had a very good starting point. It's not exactly the same. These two images were taken 30 to 40 minutes apart. Maybe that's a little stretch. Maybe more like 20 minutes apart. But they were different enough that I did need to adjust things afterward. And primarily, that was the highlights and shadows, whites and blacks, are a little bit different. Not much, but just a little bit different. I did the same thing with white balance. After copying it over, I sampled at the same point I did at the top of the dome so that we get a consistent white balance. And then in hue and saturation, these were pretty much the same with, I think, a little more tug on the saturation. I'll turn it off, and you can see there's much more of a yellowish cast. There's a lot less ambient light, and so it's just these yellow lamps giving off this pretty garish light, actually. The one other thing I did play with was in the detail area. and noise reduction. So this is a very noisy image because two reasons. One is the ISO is very high. I had it set at 2500, and that's because at this point the light on the scene was very low, and I wanted to get a short drag on the horse moving through. A little bit of motion, but if I let the shutter stay open for 1 second, 2 seconds, and so forth, the horses move through so fast they just blur and become unrecognizable. So in order to keep my aperture the same, I decided to play with the ISO to get my shutter speed into about 1/4 of a second. And that gave me a nice sense of motion in this horse-drawn carriage. But the high ISO means noise. So let me zoom in right in this area here, maybe a little bit closer. Come on, there we go. So we can get a good look at what this noise reduction did. So here is before the noise reduction. You can see all of this color noise is terrible, and quite a fair amount of luminance noise as well. And so turn that on after. I didn't care too much about detail. I did bring it up a bit, so I kept some crispness between the oranges of the wheels and the seats, and then the black of the body of the car. But this is a moving object, and so extreme detail is not important here. So those are the adjustments made in Lightroom, and now I'll select both of these images here, and we'll send them over to the Perfect Photo Suite, File, Plugin, Extras, and I want to open them as layers in Perfect Layers 9. So these two layers here are what I brought in from Lightroom. I've obviously done some work here. I've done the masking, I've done some compositing and some Perfect Effects work, and I'll walk through that briefly here in just a moment. The main thing I wanted to highlight to you right now is the masking work and what went into that. So the top layer that I have, if I hide this very bottom layer, this is the main base image that had very few people. It just didn't have the horse-drawn carriage. And what I have on the bottom layer, so here, this is where I've got the horse, but a whole bunch of tourists and pedestrians and people out enjoying their evening. So masking them together, I put my base image, which had almost everything I wanted, on the top, and then I punched down to reveal the horse-drawn carriage. I'm going to zoom into this area, maybe about that much, maybe one more tick out here with a command minus, to show you that there's the mask is imprecise. Control M to show you the mask. So here's the mask, and there's all of this stuff all around on the stonework here, and that was to get a decently smooth blend. As I toggle this top layer off and on, and you'll see the background change, you can see that in my base image this is crisper. Again, this was a very low ISO shot, was the first shot here, so there's a lot more detail, there's a lot less noise, you're getting to see all those seams in the concrete. And then when I have the high ISO shot, remember I applied noise reduction, that's smoothing out a lot of these lines, and so I'm losing that detail. If I were to try to have just a very harsh mask, for example, let's do this. This is masking in way too much information and revealing this lower layer entirely too much. That does not look good at all. Undo that. Likewise, if I try to tighten this up and just make it around the horse-drawn carriage, you can see the same thing happens. The wheels look funny, the stonework doesn't line up and doesn't match, and so that doesn't work either. That's why a lot of this small masking at about 20% or so is about where I started, and just slowly working through here, and then using the blur tool, which only blurs mask lines, and kind of smoothing all of that through just to get everything smeared out. And in the end I resulted with this, and I was pretty happy with this. As I was looking at the wheels, they felt a little strange to me because they looked kind of flat and square, until I checked the bottom layer, and that's kind of how they looked, and it makes sense as I thought about it because they're moving, right? The top edge of that circle is going to be moving from here to here over the 1/4 second that I was exposing. So that actually does make sense once I was able to get my brain to accept that. So once I had the masking done, I made a new stamp layer. So that was, layer, new stamp layer, and created this composite layer. I'll turn that on. And you can see I've obviously done some effects on this as well. I wanted to make it a little darker, a little moodier, and took care of some cleanup. There was a little bit of straggling pedestrians here. There was this ugly street sign. Cleaned that up as well. And then the very last thing is I duplicated this layer again and added a double vignette to make this segment of the photo even more shadowy so that our eyes are drawn. Obviously this light's going to catch eyes and this light's going to catch eyes, but bouncing between them, suddenly we start to see, oh, here is the carriage is moving toward the cathedral is standing nice and tall, and your eyes start to bounce around up along these things. So you're moving in and around and through the frame, staying in the general area that I wanted to have your eyes drawn to. And even this curve, there's a little bit of a more light here, and you get this curve and this sweep of the square, the turning around the corner here. So all that fit together pretty nicely. Let's jump into effects on the first composite layer, and I'll walk through what got us from here to here. All right, so here's the image, the composite image that we put together. The first thing was the color enhancer, and that was for the sky. And so slight tug down on the temperature and increasing the blue channel to deepen this evening blue hour sky. Second color enhancer, and you can tell by the mask this was applied in just certain areas, and that was for the greens. Straight preset, the green enhancer, and just boosting those greens back up of the trees, the shrub, and the palm tree over here. So Control M, you can see where I've masked the effect in and where it's been removed from. There was dynamic contrast, and you can see that is going to add punch to the buildings. And I removed that punch from the lower part of the scene. I want this area crisp. I want the lower part soft, and in particular keeping the horse-drawn carriage soft, so it's not going to crispen up something that should be smooth and flowing. I further enhanced that with a blur. So the blur here is a very slight blur. Look at the layer opacity is all the way down at just 11. So just a very slight touch of blur in the lower part of the frame. You can see the mask where it's black. There's no blur happening up at the top at all. Next was a glow, and again the same type of thing. A very slight amount. Right here the amount's only 12, and same type of thing. Just adding a little more softness, touch to this foreground area. So it's keeping the thing that's going to really catch our eyes being the cathedral, and then this horse-drawn carriage remaining soft. And last but not least, a vignette to darken the edges and draw our eyes in a little bit further. So I'm having a video refresh issue. It'll catch up in a minute. But that's my standard vignetting technique. Do the brightness, feather it down, size it appropriately, and then smooth it all back out by bringing the feather back up. So that is the processing. I think that the main challenge here was getting the masking right and making the blend look smooth. And that took a fair amount of trial and error. I've done maybe 2 or 3 passes at it, and it wasn't looking very clean. But once I got the blend, the blending done, I should say the smoothing of the masking done right, everything else really kind of fell into place. And I like the story that this image tells. A tip of the week, I guess, with masking is it may take several times. Be persistent with your masking. You might not get it right the first time. A lot of videos, my own included here, you're going to just see the approach that worked. There were several approaches that didn't work, and I'm obviously not going to waste your time with those in a short video like this. So don't be discouraged if the first time you try to mask 2 images together, it doesn't quite look right or it looks artificial. Just go back, make some tweaks, and try again, and you will get it. That is it for this week's episode of In Post. Hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, give me a thumbs up, a like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, tell a friend. anything to let me know that you're getting some value out of these videos, and that helps me coming back to do more and more of them. If you have any other comments you'd like to reach me, you can contact me directly through my website. I do my very best to answer every email within a day or two. And it's been great hearing from lots of you, and I hope that continues in the future. So until next time, my name's Scott Davenport, and thanks for joining me.